use the word rubbish.
Okay, I do need to mention a couple things that I have not yet said. Several of you asked about your papers, and I'm getting ready to go to Scotland Thursday, and we'll be there all next week. In fact, this time next week, Scottish time, I'll be teaching my leadership academy with all the prefects of the schools, so be praying for me. But I do hope to use that time to read your first papers. I just haven't had a break yet. So remember that those are works in progress. So if you did it, you'll get full credit for it. The grade that I'm concerned about is your final paper, and you do have an opportunity to revise. So I know you're anxious to get word back from me, and I'm anxious to give you word. I just hadn't gotten to it, but I will. So that's what I use my traveling time for, is to get caught up in grading. So I'm looking forward to that. All right. Any thoughts out of the first part of class then? I want to make sure we understand again that, in a sense, you almost have to do away with your understanding of leadership as it was once done. I'm going to come back to it, especially as it pertains to some biblical ideas. And so I'm stepping out of Roxborough now. I think Roxborough gave us a good foundation to work out of, but I want to go back and review this idea of first and second order narrative, which I find extremely helpful in identifying what our call is, and that is that everybody has their first order story, and they're looking for meaning in a larger story. This is called faith, and everybody has faith in some story. And if the reason they live as they do is because they think their understanding of the world is the best explanation there is, or they wouldn't live there. So people who adamantly reject any kind of belief in God almost always have a really good reason to believe that. And that what we're trying to do as leaders is trying to give people an opportunity to paint with new colors in a new way that makes their life beautiful, even out of the darkness that may be there. That each life represents God's amazing creativity in a unique way. And the amazing thing about the story, God's story, is that it tells us that the artistic beauty of each life depends on what second order story they embrace. So they're either going to be able to paint something really redeeming and beautiful, even if they've had a lot of darkness in their life, or they're going to embrace a story that just has them continue to paint in really dark colors. And again, don't hear this as sort of the tiptoe through the tulips kind of stuff, that we can't take darkness and just make it pretty, but you take that darkness and give it hope, because we believe there is a better time to come. And it may not even be in their life that they experience it, but they can know this. There is no suffering that they endure that doesn't have meaning. And in the context of any other story that I know of, suffering is just a part of it. And even some of the Eastern religions like Buddhism, the idea is you disengage yourself from the suffering because life is just basically suffering. And so if you're going to find a way out, you just elevate yourself above that as if it's not real. This story fully engages the suffering. I mean, it's a major theme in Scripture. But it shows us that even out of death there can come life, and so there is real hope in helping people revision their future in the kingdom. So missional leadership's primary purpose is to equip each member unto Christ-likeness for the purpose of finding their place in the body of Christ. So that's that Ephesians 4 model that we've talked about all semester, where we equip people by bringing them to full maturity in Christ, which allows them to find their place in the working body of Jesus in such a way that they're contributing to the ultimate well-being of creation itself. And I want to again say, I've finished my scheduling for the summer pretty much, part of which is a trip that I'll take in May like I usually do to Italy. And I'll be working with I'll be working with a church that I told you the story about Giuseppe, the little guy that, I'll be working at that church, which I'm really excited about because I want to see how they're doing. This is 5 or 6 years later. He's since gone to be with the Lord, but that whole idea of telling them that just down the road from them there was a soccer game going on that the whole world was looking at, and the fact that they had an opportunity to do something of greater significance than any of the players on the field, and seeing their stunned look and even whimsical, this guy's nuts look. But coming to realize that, what they have done is pretty phenomenal. And, helping people recognize their life could be so much more in God's story. That's the work of missional leadership. So the greatest gift you can possibly give a person is to help them discover God's dream for them. To let them see what God sees and not what the world sees when they look in the mirror. Now, I don't mean for that to be simplistic and triumphalistic, because Amy's in the room and I can't talk about brokenness without recognizing.
That's beautiful and entirely appropriate.
Yeah. But it's not simple either. I don't want to be simplistic here, right?
It's not we just help them along the way. They're discover it
Right.
themselves.
And it may be that, however you want to picture that, sometimes we need to take out some bright paint and sort of squish it onto their palate, squeeze it out, because they haven't had anyone. I have a good friend who has become a participant in a program called CASA, where he is an advocate for people who have been brought to court for neglecting their children or whatever, and he's the advocate of the child. Okay? So he goes into these really broken situations, but he's been trained in appreciative inquiry. And he has story after story after story of when he goes in and sits down with a young woman in unthinkable circumstances who has mistreated their child, not necessarily out of just neglect, but out of, you just can't imagine situations. We just don't know. Amy knows, but we just don't know if you're not into that brokenness. But he always tries to sit down and find something in their file that shows that they have been either trustworthy or they've done something good, and he'll focus on that. And he said their demeanor changes like you can't believe, because they come into that environment getting ready to get beat up like they always do. And first thing Steve will say is, "Hey, I noticed that you've never missed taking your child to the doctor on time. I just want you to know that's phenomenal, because I know you want what's best for the child." And you just see all the defenses drop. He's working out of a different story. He's not working out of the story of, I'm going to advocate for this child. I'm going to punish you for the bad things you've done to this child. He's seeing that there's brokenness there and that the brokenness is redeemable. And I think that's a beautiful picture of what we could be. But when you think about many times how the world sees us, is we're just judgmental sons of guns who don't really much care about the world. And so this idea of image management, that in the absence of God's story, one will image oneself according to the demands of the world. I have to be really careful how I treat this, especially with my undergraduate students, because we still have a problem on this campus with anorexia and bulimia, which to me is just unimaginable. But the pressures of our culture are so great that a young woman will do harm to her body to measure up to an ideal that she'll never get to.
That's my long appointment today was with a 55-year-old white man who has schizophrenia and has for years been on disability for 40 years. And he's got some sort of delusion, I don't know what it is yet, but he's 6 feet tall. And after months of bulimia, binging and purging, his weight dropped 88 pounds.
6 feet tall, 88 pounds. My goodness. So, I'm not suggesting to you that this is easily fixed, but I am saying I do think this is the answer. That the reason that we will punish our bodies is because we're trying to pursue an image that we can't attain, all right? And this whole self-saturated self. So this question, I think, is very significant. Who do you see when you look in the mirror? Do you see God-like potential or failure to meet expectations? And I think this is a major crisis in our culture because this is the way we sell goods that people don't really need. We convince them that we have something that will make them something that they presently aren't. And so the idea of created in the image of God is the greatest possible story for human beings. And what comes along with that is a very, 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 very significant verse in Colossians chapter 2, where it says, "You have been made complete in Christ." And if I could give a gift to my undergraduate students, I would want them to hear that so that they could be free from the pressure of the world to become something other than who they are. Okay, you have been made complete in Christ. Now, that doesn't mean God's going to leave you there. He loves you too much to leave you there, but He loves you right where you are. You've been fully accepted. And as far as he's concerned, you've been made complete, so now you're free to become everything that God has created you to be. Okay, so that plays into what I've talked to you before about shame and how shame just burdens people, where the joy of becoming. The joy of becoming. This is what the mission leader does. Now, it can't be empty praise, and you can't give people things they cannot attain. I think one of the issues that I had as a coach is I had to make sure, because I wanted to be an encourager, but I didn't want to tell an athlete they could reach something that I knew they couldn't. It's just not helpful. But to recognize that they could go beyond what they thought they could, that's another thing. So in other words, I didn't want to set up objectives that they could never reach, but I did want to give them a vision of what they could yet become. And so this image of God thing is really important. I'm working through this in my undergraduate class right now on faith and culture. That if you're not pursuing the image of God, you're pursuing the image of something else. And the image of God is one that you can graciously pursue, that the Spirit of God is going to help you with, and it allows you to be exactly the person God created you to be. All other images are distortions of what God created. Now, you either believe that or you don't, but what Jesus invites us to is, by the way, that's a really neat idea, that the word righteousness, dikaiosune, that's what that means. It's a heavy word, and we look at it as being rightness, but the idea is you're living the life you were created to live. It matches up. You're justified, you're made into that which God created you to be. So this is the gift of the missional church that I think the conventional church cannot provide. Because what the conventional church says is attend and comply. What the missional church says is we need you. So we have some work to do. Because you're probably not ready, and we're probably not ready. But let's work on this. Does that make sense? So you can see now that the mission leader is not necessarily the one up front going rah, rah, rah. It's the one who's walking beside as Jesus walked beside. Now, you know, John 14:3-16, maybe some of the more significant texts in terms of personal application to us, where Jesus talks to his disciples about leaving his Holy Spirit. And he says, I'm not going to leave you alone. I'm not going to leave you as orphans. I will leave you another parakletos. Okay, another parakletos. What does that suggest? Another. They've had one. And so who's the first one? Jesus. So parakletos, para is to walk beside. Kletos is to advocate, counselor. So here's a walk beside counselor. That's what the Holy Spirit is. It's one who walks beside us and counsels us how to live in the image of God, so that ultimately we live holy lives. And again, I would say that all these words that we've looked at as being religiously weighted, like holy. Okay, that's the character of God. What's the character of God? Well, there are characteristics of God that all of us ought to have in terms of what, kindness and the fruit of the Spirit. But the idea of holy is as individualistic as the person who is holy. It doesn't look like one thing. It's the image of God in you. You are set apart for God. Okay, so how did God gift you to that end? You understand what I'm saying? Holiness doesn't look the same. You can't institutionalize holiness. It's as diverse as God's creative plan. It's everybody working fully as God created them to be as a part of a community. So realizing the full potential of human life. So Jesus comes to give us new eyes, not only for seeing the world, but for seeing ourselves. And if the missional leader doesn't have the eyes of Jesus, he or she will not be an effective leader. Meaning if he can't look at a person as Jesus would look at that person and be filled with both compassion and love and have infinite patience. Study Jesus for a minute. Okay, who did he seem to have infinite patience with? Sick sinners and his bumbling disciples. Why he didn't kick them in the butt or kick them into the creek or something, kick them occasionally, because you got to see him occasionally. Well, I do think the one time he gets a little bit exasperated is when they think they have enough swords to take on the Roman army. And I think what Jesus says there is not, that's enough, like, wow, that's impressive. It's like, enough of that. It could be taken either way. It just seems to me that there he's pretty tired of them.
In John 14:9, he says, "Don't you know me, Philip?"
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's some expressions there where you go, yeah, okay. But he never runs out of patience. I mean, with Peter, for goodness sakes, right? That gives us all hope. Don't we all love Peter? But who does he not have much patience with? Pharisees, religious leaders. What's that about? They needed to see themselves for who they were. Notice that Jesus responds to the needs of the person he speaks to based on what their needs are. So he's not fair. But fair isn't all that it's put out to be. What he is honest and faithful. And so, well, that's exactly what the Pharisees needed. They needed to be rad. No one did that. No one did that to the Pharisees. Nobody. Jesus did. And nobody did that to the lepers. Nobody touched them. Jesus did. Nobody would even think about embracing a prostitute when he's surrounded by Pharisees. Jesus did. What he constantly did was simply act out his redemptive love. And so here's the deal. The truth sets us free from the tyranny of idolatrous lies. Okay, I like that line. All right, so this is what we do. You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. What does that mean? You get to be who you really are. That's true freedom. Now, that's not freedom as antinomianism, meaning you don't have any law. It's freedom that you have been freed into the image God created you to be. Let's put all these words together. Holy, righteous, justified, sanctified, life in its fullest expression. And this is what Jesus offers us. And that's what we as missional leaders are called to do, is to help people into that understanding of themselves. And by the way, my experience has been that as people come to understand this, one of the things that accompanies it is just an explosion of creativity. Because a lot of the things that have been suppressed in their lives now become opportunities for expression of what they truly believe. Now, I've seen that with my students. I've told you about that. And you've seen some of the examples of that. I think, I did tell you about the young lady who expressed herself through dance that I found really confusing because I've never been able to interpret that form of expression. But while she provided a really good explanation of what she did, you wouldn't have had to tell that to me by just watching what she watched. It was beautiful in terms of her going to all kinds of incredible amount of work to express herself because it was her way of expressing her true belief. All right, so leaders need to be able to tell the true story of life. And this is what sets the missional imagination. And so basically what leaders do is they need to help people or help a community live in God's story. So I don't know what that looks like in your situation. But I want to go back to Terry's question earlier that I think is so important, is this form of leading doesn't have to be done from the pulpit. It can be in a very encouraging, side-by-side kind of where you're with an individual and you're letting them see themselves in new light. It's what I think was Barnabas's ministry, the ministry of encouragement, right?
This is the light bulb that went off on me this past week before I emailed you.
Talk to me about it.
I just realized that it was one of those things where I've been frustrated about not being able to do this, right? Because
Yeah.
I'm not the preacher, because I'm not the guy, I'm not the one in the elders meeting to help influence these people. And I thought this is just going to happen. And I thought, wait a minute, I'm second.
Wait a dadgum second.
Yeah,
Huh?
it can be done in my context in this manner in small batches. And so it was a matter of going, you know what? I don't have to be this
Right.
to do this.
That's right.
And it was just like I felt, and just met, and it was amazing. I was on the lift. I told Chris just humming, reading, and it was just a burst of energy. And I was like, okay.
Okay, now what's interesting about that to me, burst of energy, what's that mean? It means that now you have creative capacity again, right? So that's where the energy comes from.
I almost think it cannot be done from the pulpit. I think it has to be done small groups, personal, maybe not one-on-one, but two-on-one or something to walk with somebody as you...
Yeah, and I think the pulpit can be extremely helpful in going along beside of. But this is what I've told preachers all along, which, by the way, I'm not very popular among preachers for this, but pulpit is way overrated. Now, it can be a really important part of a larger purpose for the church, but it can't be the focus of it.
I'm not sure people are listening like they used to.
I don't think so either.
I think they listen to your actions.
Yeah. And
That's what they react.
there's all kinds of reasons for that. I mean, studies have shown that people don't listen like they used to. But we don't. What other environment do you go and sit and just listen to a person talk to you? Class. Well, I mean, in schooling environments we do that, but where else? I mean, in a normal flow of life, because most people have been out of school environment for a long time that come to our churches.
Right.
So they're learning in all these different ways, hands-on, whatever. They're winging it.
When's it going to be over?
They come with a certain expectation of involvement. They're not listening.
It goes back to this performative model. Though. Our preaching falls under all of this.
Yeah.
You're going to get what you need or what
Yeah,
you want
yeah,
to hear,
right.
and you're gonna give me what I need to. Whatever he said some wonderful things. I should go back and look at it again or highlight it. But
Yeah.
you're not going to be a participant. You're going to be, what is it? It was like you're going somewhere to be waited upon.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, that's part of it. Right.
When we go there to be encouraged, how do we get encouraged? Okay.
Well, and there's
Yes,
still, I've been in places in the world, there's some places I've been in the world where I'll never forget the shock I had when I was invited to a little community down in southern Italy, which that's a whole story I could tell you about, but it was still pretty much controlled by the mafia. I actually had to be accompanied by a former mafia boss to get up the mountain to the village where I was going to work with the church, because you didn't go through there without permission.
Stick an Allen.
And it was amazing. The head of the village that I was going to had been in prison for killing a man. He was a mafia hitman, and in prison he had been converted. So he owned that village. I mean, he was the hitman. He was the capo guy. And so he goes back to that village and converts them all. Doesn't have a church, and so he invites me to come down and tell them how to do church, right? So it was very... It's hard to think of this in Italy, but there are places in Italy that looked like third world. There was very little electricity. None of the houses were finished. Everybody grew their own food. It was just they were very poor. And when the sun went down, they went to bed. But when the sun came up, they woke up. And this was summer, so the sun came up about 4:30, and we were staying in a little house in the middle of town, and everybody was up and around, and chickens, and it was an interesting thing. But I'll never forget the evening. When they came out of the fields at 4 o'clock, they started the evening service. 4 o'clock, just very unconventional. So I got up, and I don't know that I've ever had a more attentive group in my life. There were about 50 people in this little ramshackle of a building, and they were all there listening. Now, they weren't writing because about half of them were illiterate, but they were listening. I mean, you know when someone's listening, right? So I waxed eloquent, man. I went for about an hour and felt pretty good about it, and then I sort of turned and went and sat back down, and it's just sort of awkward. I was sitting there, and someone said, "Get back up!"
Keep talking.
I said, "What?" He goes, "Sun sets at 8:30. It's 5. We got 3 more hours." Every night. We went 4 hours every night.
wow. Hungry. He's hungry.
They don't watch television. They were listening. I mean, and then I thought, oh, this is what it was like to be on the frontier. Tent meetings, gospel meetings, when everybody would come from everywhere. This was the biggest show in town, right? And our crowd grew every night, and we were going 4 hours a night. People were coming from the surrounding villages. It was the wildest experience. But that's not where we are anymore.
Were you zapped after that, or were you energized after?
Oh, I was energized. I was out of soap because, good grief. 4 hours about all the sermons I had my whole life at that point, I went through it. I was going to bed at night with a flashlight going, "What's the Bible say about that?" I blew through my whole week of material on the first night. I really did. Wow. But it was so energizing because they were asking questions, very interactive, and I had a pretty close view of the kingdom then, but even in the limited understanding I had, they were thirsty for Scripture. But I say that to say we're not there now. And so what we have to recognize is we have certainly a much more participative model that we've got to embrace. So leaders need to help each individual find their place or role in the kingdom. And so a missional leader by nature has to be much more involved at the grassroots level. Now, we're all going to have different roles in this. And obviously this is going to work better in small groups, but I don't think it's any less important even in larger churches. We've got to have talent scouts and coaches at every level. And so I'm asking churches to consider this. How do you develop the kind of leadership structure that allows people to develop. I'm asking you to dream with me on this, because some of you may want to do this with your project. It's, how do you do individual development within and for the sake of community? It's not just a matter, you're not trying to produce individual stars, you're trying to produce functioning parts of the larger community. So it has to do with community. Now, what's the missing component? Well, in many churches, it's creative, livable narrative. I keep running into this at all levels. That when I ask questions about what motivation is there for participating in church activities, in the absence of a meaningful story, people go because they're expected to. They go because of family responsibilities, and what I found out is a lot of people, I can't say majority, but a lot of people, I said, if it weren't for family and expectations, would you go to church? And the answer is no. So that's why I think this idea of infusing a meaningful narrative where, I was telling about this little community down in southern Italy. Anytime the church doors were open, people were there. They wanted to be there. Now, granted, there wasn't anything else to do except work, but there was a hunger there. But so is it interesting? You know that they didn't take up a contribution in that church? They had no money. They bartered. They had no stores. A truck would drive up and down the road with goods, and they would barter. So you would give him a piglet, and then that would give you so many goods for whatever it was. It was fascinating. So they couldn't take up a contribution, but they did accept offerings of work, and so people had different responsibilies. So actually, I had a person tell me that couldn't be a faithful church if they didn't take up a collection. But I'll let that person think what they want to. Okay, I was telling that story somewhere. I thought it was a really meaningful story, and I had someone chew me out for it. Okay, Jesus comes to give us life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And that involves flourishing. And this is what I've talked to you before about, the dikaiosune, righteousness. John calls it eternal life. Okay, I really do think that in the absence of returning to this story, we're in serious trouble. That what's going to bring people back is that there is something life-giving about the community. It's not the pulpit experience, it's the community of people coming together to find their place in the larger story. So God has created all in His image, unique, purposeful, all have gifts to give, essential to the working of the body, and that amazing image in 1 Corinthians 12, where you have all kinds of parts, all different pieces. And, Paul goes over several things there that I think are so much a part of the story. You have a superiority complex. Some pieces saying, well, you're not that piece, so I don't need you. Paul says, yeah, you do. An eyeball by itself is just weird. It's not very useful. It's got to have the rest of the body or it has no function. But then you have some people that, I hear this all the time, more than the superiority. Although, I tell you how preachers often express superiority. They'll say things like, I just can't believe none of you do what I do. I've heard that. Well, first of all, they have real jobs. Secondly, they don't have your gifts. And thirdly, you're not really encouraging them to do what you do because you're a self-righteous son of a gun. But what I hear more often is what I call spiritual inferiority. Like, I can't do that. I can't stand up in front and speak. I can't. And they'll talk about themselves and things that they cannot do, to which we need to say, well, praise God, because you're as important as anyone else, but understand what your role is. And that's not diminished. And then Paul even says, it's sort of embarrassing, but he says there are certain parts of our body that we cover up. Now, they are essential, but we're not going to parade them around. And so what does the body do when they have certain parts that are still essential to the function? We honor them all the more. And churches where I've seen that kind of dynamic are an amazing thing to see. Where we go out of our way to facilitate the need of everyone to participate. So God's intent for His people is we are created to contribute to God's purposes for creation. Those purposes have been co-opted by the false story of self-glory, right? Jesus came to fully redeem our lives. The church is intended to be that contrast community showing the world what life is. Have I beat this up too much? I mean, this is the whole idea of the missional church, is that it's a place where we find the truth about ourselves. And we're all trying to spend... Here, let's see if you can find this helpful. I was trying to work through this today in spiritual formation. Your bodies work in a particular way. They're an amazing storehouses of energy. So the Jewish way of thinking about the day, you go to sleep at the first part of the day, sunset. And the first third of the day you give to God. And what he does is he takes all the energies in your body and the food that you've eaten and metabolizes it into usable energy. So you wake up in the morning with usable energy, and you're going to spend it in some economy. You will generally spend it in the story that you think gives you the highest return. So every thought that you have requires energy, right? It's an electric impulse. So your thinking is burning energy. Now, don't try to lose weight that way. You can't think that much. But you know what I'm saying is that takes energy. The way your body works is it expends energy all day long. At the end of the day, if you took an account for the energy that you'd spent and the words that you'd said, the actions that you'd done, the thoughts that you'd had, what story would they point to? And what I don't want is for that to sound oppressive. What I do want is if we could have the discipline to surrender obedience, every thought take captive to the obedience of Christ, that we would live the best possible life. That it's not restricted, it's free. Because it lets us use our energies for that which really matters. And so this is the invitation that we're trying to invite people into, is that they would produce cultural goods that are consistent with the purpose for which God created them. And in my experience, when you can match people up to a life for which they were created, and some people find it on their own, and we just need to acknowledge it. But some need directed partly because of the misdirection they receive from godly people in terms of what they... I mean, I can't tell you how many people I've had upset and come to me saying, I just don't think I'm a spiritual person because... And then they tell me something that they've been asked to do that they just can't do. Does that make sense?
It does, and what's wild about it is as this is manifested more and more, the more people I've seen even in our church body in the last month who are, what you just said, living out. They're matched up with something that they're doing, but it's not being named for what it is. And they're not being encouraged for it. They're not even being, and not that it's about pointing them out, but I can only imagine how much more contagious it would be to link the name to what's going on with what that person's doing, and to have the buy-in behind it. Instead of just, that's little such and such who does whatever she does over there. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
She's passionate about it. She comes up here every week and does this, and she's on fire for it. Why? And calling it what it is.
See, and if you can match people up with that, then they become leaders without being leaders. So it's matching passions to the world's needs, and then watch out. And I've seen this.
Best eHarmony ever.
I mean, I've seen we'll use a better analogy.
Yeah, better analogy. Better name.
But that's a good idea, though. What you're trying to do is the church ought to be that, eHarmony. I mean, it ought to be matching our passions to our purpose. Mm. And churches that I've seen that function well, by the way, it's almost always contingent on leaders in specific ministries that are passionate about what they do and know how to invite people into the journey instead of beating people up if they're not a part of it. That doesn't work well. And I've been a part of churches where you had competing ministries. It's like little kingdoms within the church, and if you're on our team, you're good. If you're on the other team, you're bad, even within the same church, and that's just stupid. So the person who's confident in what they're doing will never be negative toward other manifestations of ministry. It's when it becomes power-oriented that it becomes distorted. So, I mean, I know about that. I mean, I worked in missions for all my life, was invited into a church where I was associate minister, and the missions committee never invited me to speak with them because they didn't want me to be a part. In fact, they sort of told me to stay away. You know, this is our area. They were very protective of it. And even though I had lived almost all my life and involved in that, they didn't want my expertise. They wanted me to stay away from it because they had, that's not healthy. Obviously, that's not the way a body works. This hand doesn't say to this hand, don't come over here. They work together pretty well. right? In fact, this is smart hand for me, and this is stupid hand. Stupid hand can't do anything the smart hand doesn't do. In fact, most of what smart hand does, stupid hand wants to do. That's why I can't play the piano. Because stupid hand's always looking over to see what he's doing, and it doesn't work, right? So you understand what I'm saying. You take that into account and figure out how to use it so that it's all to the glory of the head. So the church responsibility is to develop the unique expression of Imago Dei in each member, helping them fully develop that image as ministry. I really like that statement. I wrote it, but I like it. It's what I'm trying to do to pull all this down, distill this down. I shouldn't have claimed that, but it hits me. This is taking everything we've talked about in this class so far and distilling it into a sentence. The unique nature of the Imago Dei is just probably the biggest impact this study through this time through this study is. That's the idea that's hit me most, because I've seen it in just really spectacular ways. And when it's matched to a missional purpose, it just ignites a fire. And then I think about how much ministry is just mismatched. That's one of the reasons why I have to be careful how I say this, because I've written my own version of this, but spiritual gifts inventories. Generally what they are prejudiced towards certain answers. So you add them all up and then you say, okay, this is what you need to be doing. And I've seen people do spiritual inventories and then look at what it describes them as doing and they go, huh? That doesn't seem like me, but I guess it is because that's what it says. Well, they're limited because they're done with the idea of trying to bring out a particular conclusion. And I don't think it works that way. I think it's an expansive model where we get people and spark that missional imagination. Now, we need to be there to help them with that. We need to help them process through that. But we also need to allow them to fail. But if we could see our purpose, that Imago Dei in every member, particular to that member, helping them fully develop that, and then let them use that as ministry. And remember, ministry means to be a go-between. That is, you take what you're gifted with and give it to those who need it. Now, that can be expressed in a lot of different ways. It might be expressive art, and then it doesn't look so much like a cultural good where someone says, oh, thank you, I really needed that. But if they do something that brings joy to someone else, isn't that a gift? Or some kind of expression where they're really good at expressing themselves, and that blesses the church. That's a gift. So, what about leadership objectives? Well, objectives are determined by the contours of the institution. What does that mean? Well, of the story, of the reality as seen by the institution. So we generally will define objectives based on what we want the institution to produce, right? So I've told you about this before, but the research that I've done in missional studies is that most churches produce exactly the kind of behavior they're designed to produce. And it's really interesting because for the most part, leaders, the complaint I get from leaders, I'll get 2 or 3 a week where I'll get emails that say, do you have any resources you can recommend? We just can't get our people engaged. We just can't do it. And then, I'll have an outreach minister call me and say, or minister involvement. That's a treacherous job. Because basically what you're trying to do is get people involved in things they're not interested in. It's just not a good idea. So I really think what we need are ministers of missional imagination, so that we're not creating systems to control ministry. We're creating a story that allows for creative expression. And so, again, the research is pretty clear to me that churches complain about behavior, that the system itself is producing the very behavior they're complaining about. So it's Dallas Willard, I think, who says that generally systems produce exactly what they're designed to produce. So the system is broken because it's trying to perpetuate an institutional story that no one's excited about anymore. And they're stuck. And so when I ask my students today, what keeps you from wanting to be involved in a church? And they're sort of like, what does that mean? Involved in church? Does it mean like going to church? Why would we want to do that? I mean, that's a really good question. Now, what compounds it is the older people are sitting there going, well, we did that, but it's a different world now. And that social need that we used to meet in the church can be met in 1,000 different ways. And most of the time, they can do it with the palm of their hand, right? And now, it's not the same, but it is for them. All right, so outcomes are determined by expectations. All stories for humanity, of all the stories, the biblical story gives humanity's highest calling. So you have this wonderful story, and I'll go back to the very beginning. You have the 6 days of creation that gives humankind the responsibility to co-create. I think that's the trajectory of the story. I think it has nothing to do with 24-hour days. It has everything to do with ordering and purposing. Where God creates the possibilities in the realms, days 1, 2, and 3, days 4 and 5 and 6, he inhabits the realms, and then on day 6 he turns to humankind and says, see what I did? I created realms, I inhabited realms, now have fun. You get to do that too. But you're going to have to use the stuff I made. But otherwise, go at it. So I think this is where we have an opportunity to introduce our people to a whole different view of their life. The church is an academy to help shape and develop people's creational intent. Man, that's what I think worship is. Then people are a part of it. Man, you think they're not going to worship? It gets almost scary, joyous. Looks more like a football game. The way we've been doing the Lord's Supper lately, I told you at Woodmont we're doing the praise and then teaching to the table, and then people were trying to script the discussion to the table. They actually get up and walk to the table. And we had a visitor the other day say, this is like a tailgate party, and they were being condemning, but I was pretty pumped. I thought that was great. Because what do you do at a tailgate party? Eat bratwurst.
Together,
Yeah, you get together and you're talking,
Sure.
and you're excited, encouraged. There's a game to go to.
Mm-hmm.
You got a team to be concerned about. There's excitement. There's joy. Common purpose. You're dressed for the occasion. And bratwurst too. It doesn't get much better, right? Well, just think about what that could be in terms of a moment of celebration, because I'm convinced the early church, it wasn't the quiet moment of reflective sorrow for Jesus dying. It was a collective celebration of life because he's risen. In full account of what had happened to him, which cost him his life, in deep gratitude for that. But look, until the church has a sense of discovery and adventure, our young people won't come back. Agree, disagree?
Agreed. Falling off. Meters falling off.
See, this is what I want to say in my chapter. Some of you came in later. I'm supposed to write a chapter in a book about how parents are supposed to keep their kids faithful. And I think we can do a lot in the home. In fact, I think there's a deeper responsibility in the home than we sometimes call for. In recognizing, there's all kinds of studies on this, and I don't have time to go this direction, but the idea of seeing your child as being entrusted to you by God to develop in them their greatest possible potential for the kingdom. That if you believe that's the story of life, that's the way I am with my grandchildren now. I'm just crazy about the opportunity. The only thing I really care about in terms of my life being extended is I want to be here to help them grow up. I'm just enjoying this way too much. Otherwise, I could go tomorrow and be just really pleased because life has been really good. But what makes it meaningful and more meaningful is that I get to keep shaping lives, especially those little boogers. Right? It's just too much fun. And keeping their creative imagination alive. This last Friday night, I went to a production of Little Mermaid. It was a middle school production. Now, this is a true story of love, I think. I'm looking for points here. Now, my wife teaches middle school, so it was her students. I understand that. But I got to go with 4 of my grandkids. And they really do a good job. It was pretty amazing. It was a musical. And now the way they do middle school plays is amazing. I mean, you rent all the costumes, and it was unbelievable. It was a production that a high school couldn't have done just a few years ago. But they had a backdrop with changing scenes. But I was sitting there surrounded with my grandkids and talking to them about the marvel of God's creation. Because how many times do you get to talk to your grandkids when you're under the sea? You know, the fish are swimming around. And I just thought, and just watching their eyes be filled with the wonder of it all. And I thought, this ought to be church. Now, I'm not talking about production, am I? I don't think so. I am talking about imagination. and critical imagination and missional imagination. As they see the wonder of what God has done in the stories of the past, and then see the brokenness of the world in which they live, they begin to see the possibilities that they have of discovering adventure. And I'll go back to saying also, even and especially perhaps with people who are broken and really struggling in life, it's because of the weight that the false stories of the world have put on them. Give them a sense of the healing possibility. One of my favorite discussions this weekend was with a man who came, and I don't want to say more than I need to, but it was a moving moment for me. He came up to me, and I'm guessing he was mid-50s. He said, I'm on the spectrum. He said, I have Asperger's. And he says, I know I do. He said, I've grown up in a world where I was told that I could not love and that I could not understand certain things like grace and love and peace. And he said, but I want the world to know I have found that in Jesus. He's tearing up. He said, even though I can't express it like everyone, his self-awareness just stunned me. But he's had a good life. He has 3 or 4 children, and they're all fine. And I said, listen, you need to tell your story. Because I can't tell your story. I can tell people that I heard your story, and he gave me permission to tell it. But I said, you're passionate about this. I said, you know how many people are out there on the spectrum who think their life has no hope? I don't want to get into therapy and analysis that I'm not prepared for. But if they can hear someone say, even though I don't fully understand all of this, who of us do? Who of us can fully describe the love of God? But even in limitations, this is a new story for him. But he doesn't necessarily have an avenue to tell it in the context of normal church. But if you would create a place where you would provide, because he said, because of how I think and work, I can't write a book. And I said, no, but you can have someone help you write a book. Find someone that will sit down with you and write out your story. Because I think that's what's important. But the more I get to know my students, the more we all have stories to tell. But where are they told? So you get the preacher who can get up there and tell all his stories. And that's okay. That's a powerful way to teach. But where are we telling our stories? So what do you do when you get together with family?
You tell stories, share memories. That's especially powerful when your loved ones are gone.
Yeah.
You think about the power of memories and
Yeah.
the fun stories that.
Well, and I was just listening to you interact with Terry before class today. You're talking about your dad and your own special stories and the difference there. And that's life of stories, right?
No.
And telling stories to one another. This is not like, we're not trying to create out of the swamps of Florida an entertainment venue. We're taking the stuff of God and giving it a chance to be expressed.
Then you add the table to it, and then boy, it just all goes up.
Well, just think about that.
Awesome.
There's the table. What does the table say to every individual that gathers there?
You're welcome here, and we're going to tell you the greatest story on earth.
Yeah.
Point
And by the
stories
way,
into it.
You don't have a bit of worthiness to you, but come to the table, right? In all of your brokenness, this is the story of redemption right here. And then, you start talking about that and say, well, where is that in our theology of the church? Okay, now, look, we're going to get into this more at the end of the class, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this now, but I do think it's important for us to come to this in terms of missional leadership, that one of the things we're doing is helping people reinterpret their normal lives. I think this is absolutely essential to this move. That is, that what we have to do in theological terminology, we've got to erase the secular-sacred divide in every aspect. There is only sacred. Okay, so all of life is an expression of worship, so that we recognize we're created to participate in community with unique giftedness to contribute to the well-being of all. And then the idea of ministry, again, being go-between. You're taking what is given and distributing it appropriately to those who can benefit from it. So that when you look at texts that we've looked at all semester, like Ephesians 3:10 and then 4:11 through 16, that the idea of the church, I'm telling you, we can't do without it. But it's because we need the talent development that can only happen within the context of people believing the same story. So the church, there's this indispensable role of creative missional imagination here. Creative missional imagination as being that, part of this, again, I challenge the church at Northside to think about this, and others I've talked about, is get people in common professions together and share what you've learned about how to live out the purposes of God, not as some kind of sneaky thing, where you're slipping Bible verses under people's desks or whatever. I've heard all these different things, sort of sneaking around doing private eye kind of stuff. No, this is where you've learned ways of sharing your life. One of the things Northside is doing that I think is pretty phenomenal is they're bringing in one of those outbuildings at a school. What are those, the portable classrooms? Yeah, the portables. Okay, they had a school. Give them a portable. They're moving it onto their lot, and they're going to have a health clinic for the underprivileged. And they've got doctors in the congregation that will be making their expertise. They've got nurses. They've got dentists. So they're going to provide a full service clinic to underprivileged families in that area. And it's pretty interesting because that area is undefined. There's no defined. It's weird. It's north of North Nashville, but it's not North Nashville. It's north of North Nashville. So you're going to be north of North. I mean, it almost every other borough in Nashville has a name. They don't. So they're trying to become the center of a non-defined community. It's basically District 3 to the north. I mean, that's just who they are. So last Saturday, a week ago Saturday, they had the chief of police in, their district representative, and everyone else, and just said, basically, we're going to try to give this community something back. And so this is our plan. And the codes people who in Nashville are just known to be prickly. It went through without a second reading because they're providing care. Okay, but what's interesting to me is that since they've started this idea, people are coming out of the woodwork wanting to participate in some way, shape, or form. They had a group come to them and say, hey, we're swapping out all of our medical furniture. You guys want it? You can have it. So they're getting first-rate medical equipment that was just, this other place is just upgrading. But it's not like that doesn't have, it's good. And they couldn't believe how good it is. So anyway, they've done all this with almost no money. I see this pattern, that when you get into a creative mode and try to do something, things tend to happen. So that idea of creating that opportunity is just, it is.
But buying into the story is so significant.
Yeah.
Because in the coaching world,
Yeah.
if you're doing something well, you don't want to share that with anyone. I mean,
No.
everything is about holding on to that. And I worked with a lot of churches
Do the same.
in Africa that culturally, if there was an older man, he didn't want to spend any time with a younger man because it's not going to help benefit him.
Yep.
So why would I share anything I've learned or taken or developed in coaching with anyone else? Because I want the credit, I want the glory, and it's for me. So
Yep.
without buying into the story, it doesn't make sense.
Well, and that's really a good corrective. That whatever we do, we have to keep building that missional story that changes to where the true joy, and if people can get past themselves, the true joy is giving away what they've learned.
That's what you're doing with us, though.
Right.
I mean, this is what's.
But until you do it,
here,
you're going to protect. I mean, the natural human instinct is that you're going to hold it to yourself, right? So in a sense, this whole story heals the idolatry that we find even in religious organizations. But you got to buy into it, right? And you have to be aware that not everyone's going to buy into it for the right reason, because you can use this for self-promotion as much as anything else. So we don't live for success, we live for faithfulness. But my experience has been, once you get people into this, now look, I've had some, I can think of them right now, 2 or 3 stories of individuals who they are past leaders in churches that I continue to work with year after year. And they're just a thorn in the side of everybody. But we choose to continue to love them. They don't understand. There's one guy that just breaks my heart because he's been a warrior for the Lord his entire life. And he now is older, he and his wife. He doesn't have support from America anymore. He's retired and he has no friends, none. He's ruled with an iron fist his entire life. He's been the man. And as long as he was the one controlling the funds from America, he had all the power. And now I go and sit with him. It's a real sacrifice, a legitimate one on my part, because I've got an afternoon on my schedule to go sit with him and listen to him try to convince me to raise funds for him again. He does it every year. I know it's coming. He's just broken. So sometimes it doesn't fix. And I think you just have to keep loving, and you work around as best you can. Not everyone buys the story.
Well, I mean, that's biblical too, right?
I suppose. I wish it wasn't, but
it's been
yeah.
blind to Jesus.
Yeah, what's interesting is he's surrounded by all these young people who have such acceptance, and they're so well liked. And he tries to step into that same environment, and people just turn away. I'm talking about people in the world. He has his behavior has just been so coercive that, and his wife is in it with him. So they're this little island in the sea. It's just tragic. But that for me, that is just that much deeper incentive to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen again, because that's the old system, and it's not the only place that's true. So what you're trying to do is give a person a story that not only gives them life, but it's sustainable. All right, let me share with you a really quick article. I like this idea of incarnational choreography. And so I'm borrowing this from the Journal of Education and Christian B. I forget what the B's for. It's the Journal of Education and Christian. Anyway, that's it. Not bureaucracy. I know it's not that. It's not business either, I don't think. But anyway, it's the dynamic dance of worldview, faith, and learning. And what the authors here are working with is this idea of how does all this work together in a coherent system. And so they're basically talking about what it takes in terms of qualities of leadership. And this view of the incarnational choreography, I do quite a bit of research. I'm writing a book right now on the topic of Christian evidences, but I'm approaching it from the idea of faith and how faith and culture interact. But some of the research being done right now is just stunning. Now, not everyone has the same predisposition to read what's being found in the same way. But there's a group of cosmologists right now who have come to the conclusion that the possibility of life existing anywhere in the universe is so infinitesimally small, it's incredible that it exists here. Because of how complex complex carbon-based life is, everything has to be perfect. Not only does it have to be perfect, but that from whence it came has to all be structurally designed to get here. Meaning there's nothing about this that can be by chance. And they talk about it in terms of being a cosmological dance. Now, they're not going to attribute it to God because they can't do that, but they're doing something that's playing the music, right? Now, at the same time, my daughter just had a major article published in a major medical journal. She does research here in biology. She's a geneticist. And she was talking to me the other day about, she's studying specifically cancer research, breast cancer, and they've done some pretty interesting things here in research on campus. But she says it's amazing to her that when she sees the right reaction to cancer cells, that it's like this little micro battle where good always wins. So this is fascinating to me that you go out into the cosmos and it's this cosmological dance. Everything's working in concert. And then you go to the subatomic particles, and even there where evil is trying to overtake good, you can see that good wins the darkness. When it's appropriately understood, she's convinced God's the one who's given her the ability to do that kind of research. So the idea of an authentic embodiment of subject matter is what these authors say is the primary characteristic of an effective leader inviting people into the cosmological dance. In other words, you better be dancing. Okay? Now, that's hard on me because I have no dance in my body, but you understand what we're saying. Is that if your life is not tuned to the music, you can't introduce others to the music. Carl George, is that right? Yeah. He wrote a book called, what's the name of that book? He uses this illustration where you have a guy who has quadraphonic sound and that he really knows music well, And so people actually have this. I've seen it where he had a conductor stand. He has his house. This guy's a music aficionado. His house set up so he actually has what he calls his orchestra room. And he goes in there and listens to music, but he directs it. He's got the music. There's no orchestra, but he's listening to it. But he's directing the music. He says, what if a man came into that room who was deaf? And he could see the gracious movements of the conductor. And so he walks behind the conductor and he starts imitating the movement. And there's some rhythm there. And it feels right. It feels good. But after a while he tires because he can't hear the music. Okay, I wonder if that's not how a lot of people are living the Christian life. We see the motions and we imitate the motions, but we never hear the music. Does that help? So what the missional leader does is he introduces people to the music that he hears and lets them know how they move within that movement. And so that's what these authors talk about in terms of authentic embodiment. And then promote learning that is integrative and holistic, meaning then if you're going to lead, and you're going to lead incarnationally, and you're inviting people into the cosmic dance, then you can't give people piecemeal answers to big questions. So what you're trying to do is to give them an opportunity to integrate themselves. And I do think this is a different approach to teaching. Because I think way too much of the teaching we do in our pulpits, in our classrooms, is teaching where all the chewing has been done. All you have to do is swallow. Right?
Baby bird, mama bird.
Yeah, right. And so, the Ephesians 4 thing is, get people to be mature as Jesus, and then they won't be blown here and there by waves of deceitful scheming. So the answer to false doctrine is good teaching that gives them the opportunity to develop their own understanding of Scripture. Okay, affirm God's participation in the process. This is a really good idea. God is at work. Exemplify humility, a theology of dissent. Celebrate mystery and paradox, meaning you don't have all the answers. And sometimes it's just a mystery. Paradox means surely not, but yeah, give it a shot, see what happens. Emphasize learning communities and collaborative processes, and affirm process-oriented methods and improvisation. That's one of the better articles I've seen on the idea of missional leadership, and they don't even know the concept of missional leadership. They're coming at it from a different point of view. These are artistically oriented theologians who are sort of saying there's something going on here, there's a movement going on here, and what we understand right now is leadership as it's presently constructed isn't getting people into the music. Okay, I'm going to stop here for our second break, just in terms of time. So we'll be back for the third and final, shorter portion, obviously.